In this video, we will continue covering Chapter 8.5 of the book Spring Boot Quick Start. More specifically, we will show how to use createQuery method to execute JPQL that returns entity properties into object array, and then how to move those properties from object array into the DTO. Therefore, how to manually create DTO from the object array that was returned by the JPQL query. Since JPQL doesn't support insert statement, we will use a native query inside the loadPersons class to insert test record into database. This is a loadPersons class which implements command line runner, which will be executed when the application starts, and this single record entity record person will be inserted into database with this name and age data. Our application properties will look like this. We will have properties to configure H2 database and properties to tell Hibernate to recreate tables every time application is started and to show us executed SQLs into the console. This is how our person entity will look like. It will simply have following properties: ID, name, and age of the person. And this is how our person DTO will look like. It will only have name and age properties, and our attention is to store name and age properties from the entity retrieved from the database in this DTO. So this is a type of projection where instead of retrieving the whole entity and all of its properties, our goal is to get only some of the properties from the entity and then to store them into person DTO. Therefore, the SQL statement that will be executed will only be retrieving these properties, and this reduces the load on the database because not all the properties will be fetched. So this is how our application will look like. And the main part of this application will be our controller, which will contain the code that demonstrates this. So we will have inside this controller, we will have a single endpoint accessible through this URL, and that endpoint will return our DTO as a JSON string showing us the name and the age properties of the entity retrieved from the database. So here is a code snippet that demonstrates what we are doing. So we will first create a JPQL that selects only name and age properties from the person entity, and then these, when returned, will be stored in this object array. And then we will use following code to manually copy elements of this object array into our person DTO properties. So this will be implemented inside our controller, which, as we have already mentioned, will have only this one endpoint that execute a JPQL query select statement that only retrieves name and age properties from a person entity, and then these properties are returned from the select statement in the form of object array of object, string name, and integer age. Here we are just displaying what was returned into the console, and here we are manually copying elements of this object array into our DTO properties, and then our endpoint will return created person DTO, which will be displayed in the web browser in the form of JSON string. We can now test this application by calling URL of our endpoint, and our endpoint will return DTO in the form of JSON string. In the console, we can see the statement that has been executed, and from that we can see that only name and age properties were actually taken from the database, thus reducing the load on the database because not all of the properties of the entity have been retrieved because the ID property is missing. And these properties, when retrieved from the database, are returned to us by the SQL statement in the form of the object array containing string name and age integer. So in this tutorial we have shown how we can create a projection of entity into the person DTO by creating a JPQL select statement that only retrieves specific entity properties. These are then returned to us as an object array, and then we can manually store elements of this object array into our person DTO, and therefore this person DTO represents a projection of the person entity because it only contains a subset of properties of the person entity, and this is useful to reduce the load onto the database because only properties we are interested in are being fetched from the database.